Hello, my name is Troy Reynolds from the University of Western Australia in Perth. I'd like to acknowledge the Noongar people, traditional custodians of the never ceded land on which we're recording today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to all traditional custodians of all lands from which you are joining us today. So today we'll be looking at high-rising terminals. The high-rising terminal, also known as uptalk, is a feature of spoken language in which there's a distinct rise at the end of an utterance within a declarative syntactic frame. We are defining HRT as a rise of at least 40% in fundamental frequency between the final tonic syllable of the utterance to the final syllable of the utterance altogether. In other words, the fundamental frequency of the pitch-stressed syllable of the final intonation phrase continues to sharply rise through the rest of the syllables within a declarative syntactic framework. Early research on HRT described a predominantly female-led usage. However, more recent findings indicate that usage is now spread much more evenly between females and males. HRT has been observed in varieties of languages as diverse as German, Californian American English, Spanish, Japanese, and Arabic. Despite its superficial similarity to other intonational forms, such as that of a questioning intonation, uptalk is realized differently both in terms of form and in communicative intent. Here's an example of uptalk spoken by an Anglo-Australian adult in an interview.
It's really important that we look forward to what we have ahead of us.
Uptalk has been analysed in Australia for the last several decades, with one of the earliest studies being Barbara Horvath in 1985, looking at varieties of Australian English and the social factors surrounding their use. This study recognised that uptalk is a marker of ethnicity in Australia, with newly arrived Greek women using uptalk significantly more than Anglo-Australians and other migrants. Anna Jespersen's more recent studies of Sydney Aboriginal English, shortened to AAE here, identify more variability in the form taken by uptalk. For example, the contours and excursions of the rise in Aboriginal English when contrasted with mainstream Australian English. Further afield in our neighbouring New Zealand, Britton and Newman find that Māori New Zealanders employ uptalk 45% more frequently than non-Māori New Zealanders. There is still a great deal that is not known about Australian Aboriginal English prosody, and understanding how prosody is used in a naturalistic interaction is crucial as it can have a direct impact on how a message is interpreted. Miscommunication resulting from comprehension errors in cross-cultural situations has been demonstrated to have significant social impact across a range of settings. So in Australia, just as in many other parts of the world, rigid and asymmetrical structures of discourse in the courtroom, for example, including the pragmatic functions of prosody, routinely result in coercion and misunderstanding of defendants, victims, and witnesses. Children who are raised in an Aboriginal English L1 environment are often faced with enormous challenges in the classroom, with cross-cultural misunderstanding a major hindrance to their education. So what is Aboriginal English? Australian Aboriginal English, or AAE, is a term for a group of varieties of English spoken by Aboriginal people throughout Australia. There are approximately 800,000 Aboriginal Australians, which is roughly 3.3% of the total population of the country. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Australians make up just under 4% of the total population in Western Australia, which is where the present research is based, with around 100,000 people. Aboriginal English shares influences from Australian Aboriginal languages, Australian Creoles and British English, and is a group of varieties distinct from mainstream or standard Australian English in several ways. It's suggested that Aboriginal English is used by many, if not most, Aboriginal people in Australia in one variety or another, and that for a large number of Aboriginal children in Australia, it is often the sole L1. To adopt a comparative angle, and in the context of this preliminary study, which is part of my PhD currently in progress, we will compare AAE Uptalk to Uptalk as used by working class Australian English speakers. Working class Australian English, at times known as Broad Australian English or Vernacular Australian English, describes English varieties spoken by working class people throughout Australia, and in our case we're focusing on both Aboriginal English and working class Australian English in the Perth and southwest Western Australia region. The choice to use working class Australian English in this way is influenced by the informal observations made in the literature that among the varieties of English spoken in Australia, working class Australian English is the most similar to Australian Aboriginal English, with the primary differentiation being prosodic. Both varieties are also historically marked and considered to have lower prestige than standard Australian English or mainstream middle class or general Australian English. The present study is a work in progress and the first segment of a three-part PhD thesis examining the ways in which prosody is used differently by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal speakers of English, and which social factors constrain these prosodic features, for example age, gender and ethnicity. For the present study, we're focusing on Uptalk as an example of intonational feature of Aboriginal English, which may play an important role in the communicative intent of an utterance, and how age, gender and ethnicity may correlate with aspects of its use. It's important to add that more robust statistical analysis is yet to be undertaken, and no significance testing has yet taken place. On to the method itself. 852 declarative utterances were extracted from the first 10 minutes of dialogue from each of the 12 participant interviews, totaling 2 hours altogether. Each participant has a unique combination of 3 predictors. There are 6 women and 6 men, 6 Aboriginal and 6 non-Aboriginal participants, and 3 tiers of age groups born approximately 1960, approximately 1980, and approximately 2000. Firstly, the final intonation phrase of each declarative utterance was identified, and the fundamental frequency of the tonic syllable measured against the fundamental frequency of the final syllable of the utterance. This table shows the number of declarative utterances extracted for each of the 12 speakers in the sample. As mentioned, this is a preliminary analysis which will grow significantly in the next couple of months. Secondly, to deepen the understanding of the communicative purpose of Uptalk, utterances were coded with the switchboard Damsel shallow discourse function annotation system for dialogue acts. Switchboard Damsel, or switchboard dialogue act markup in several layers, is an annotation tool which allows us to label each utterance with one or more communicative function and subsequently map the dialogue acts of each declarative utterance alongside their prosodic features. Individual labels are grouped into broader categories such as backward communicative functions agreement, which includes accept, reject, and hold. The answer category in the switchboard Damsel system, for example, covers several response types which can be expected to follow an interlocutor's question, and breaks answers down into various subtypes based on the acceptance or rejection of the previous questioning turn and the expansion of an answer with new information. This is an example of an answer in the corpus which uses the Uptalk rise.
She was from Yearly Station.
The data used were taken from two corpora. The Aboriginal English data were collected by Celeste Rodríguez Louro and Glenys throughout 2019 in the context of Celeste's fellowship. Celeste and Glenys used the method known as yarning to secure these data. I'll tell you more about this in a moment. The working class Australian English data were recorded by Dr. Sophie Richard over 3 years with 1 or 2 participants with open-ended cues and topics where needed. The two corpora are very similar in that they include mostly storytelling. Aboriginal English data were recorded by Celeste Rodríguez Louro and Glenys using an innovative method of natural language collection tailor-made and developed for Aboriginal English fieldwork, employing yarning. Yarning is an important culturally ingrained method of storytelling, decision-making, sharing of knowledge and cooperation in Aboriginal Australia, which has been used deep into Australia's history. It involves free-flowing interaction between people with an exchange of ideas and information and is an important feature in the social and communicative pulse for Aboriginal people around the country. For more insight into yarning and the work that Celeste and Glenys are doing, you can watch Decolonising Sociolinguistics, Indigenous-led fieldwork in Noongar country, Western Australia, from this morning's session, and also check out the podcast in the link below. In this preliminary phase of the research, we found some patterns, however in many cases no observably significant difference in use between any two given demographics was clear. Overall, Aboriginal participants produced fewer tokens of Uptalk than non-Aboriginal participants. Overall, male participants produced fewer tokens of Uptalk than female participants, and overall little evidence for any significant intergenerational difference. Some difference in communicative intent was found, with answers and agreement featuring more in correlation with Aboriginal participants' use of Uptalk, and quoting speech and indicating personal understanding being more frequent with non-Aboriginal participants. In this chart, each column represents all declarative utterances extracted for each participant, with blue indicating Uptalk tokens, orange indicating rises which do not qualify as Uptalk, and grey indicating all remaining utterances. The most significant pattern indicates that non-Aboriginal speakers tended to produce slightly more high-rising terminals as well as more rises overall. When we factor for age, we did not see any significant demographic producing a greater frequency of high-rising terminals. In the case of the eldest male Aboriginal participant, no tokens of HRT were identified at this stage in the analysis. Looking at gender, male participants produced slightly less than females overall. This mirrors global trends and observations made elsewhere, in which Uptalk was initially led by female speakers in earlier periods and has been adopted increasingly by males to a period of relative equilibrium. On a ranked scale from least to most high-rising terminals as a percentage of total declarative utterances, we notice 3 of the Aboriginal participants grouped at the lower end of usage regardless of age or gender, 2 non-Aboriginal participants in the most frequent end of the scale, and both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal participants sharing the centre. Plotting each participant in terms of percentages of rises which involve HRT and looking at all 3 social predictors, we see again that female participants are using a higher proportion of high-rising terminals than male participants, and that Aboriginal participants are generally producing less than non-Aboriginal participants. Turning to the dialogue acts and their correlation with high-rising terminals, we see more significant differences between the two ethnic demographics. Although for both straightforward statements, which come under the forward communicative functions category, make up the overwhelming majority of tokens, as can be predicted, and secondly, that the category influencing the addressee for future action being roughly similar in proportion, we can see the biggest differences in the indicating understanding, answering questions, and indicating agreement categories, with Aboriginal participants using HRT when answering questions far more often than non-Aboriginal participants, at 11.9% of the time and 0% respectively. Looking at the two cohorts, we can see the differences in correlations between specific dialogue acts and the high-rising terminal. Non-Aboriginal participants appear to use both the understanding and other categories with greater frequency, with the other category largely making up of direct quotes. Non-Aboriginal participants also appear to produce more tokens correlating to the other forward function category, which includes pleasantries and exclamations, with the Aboriginal participants producing none of these utterances. On the other hand, Aboriginal participants appear to be using significantly more backward communicative functions, such as agreements with high-rising terminals, and employ Uptalk significantly more when answering questions than non-Aboriginal participants, who rarely do. In terms of age, we see some patterns emerging between the two cohorts. Among the Aboriginal participants, we see a possible decrease over time in HRT, correlating with answers and quoted speech, and an increase over time in correlating with understanding. The non-Aboriginal participants also suggest an increase over time in Uptalk correlating with understanding, but in contrast to the Aboriginal participants, an increase in correlation with quoted speech, and a decrease over time in backward communicative functions, such as agreement. When factoring for gender, we see that the Aboriginal male participants use high-rising terminals overwhelmingly for straightforward statements, and for agreement approximately a quarter of the time, far greater than any other group. The remaining three cohorts demonstrate varying degrees of correlations, with answers making up almost 20% of utterances with Uptalk for the Aboriginal female group, whereas the other cohorts only demonstrate this correlation sparingly. We still have to further refine our analysis, but we can see some mirroring of previously observed general trends, such as female use being more frequent than male, and non-Aboriginal speakers producing more tokens of Uptalk than Aboriginal speakers. The most fruitful area of analysis so far has been the link between high-rising terminals and dialogue acts, with differences and patterns emerging. Saliently around the employment of Uptalk as a device indicating understanding and answering of questions. As mentioned at the beginning, understanding how Aboriginal English speakers use prosodic cues is important. We generally look at linguistic variables that set Aboriginal English apart from other varieties and tend to focus on its phonology, grammar, or even lexicon, but until now we hadn't engaged with the suprasegmental features that set Aboriginal English apart from other Englishes in Australia. This is important because Uptalk is highly interactional and is used in conjunction with functions such as asking and answering, which have been discussed widely in the applied linguistics literature. For example, Diana Eads in 2014 argues that miscomprehension of communicative intent resulting from intercultural variation on levels such as prosody can have profound effects on the outcomes of legal cases for some Aboriginal Australian people. Thank you to the people of Noongar Budjar for sharing their yarns, and also Adele Gregory at the University of Melbourne and the UWA Centre for Applied Statistics for their technical help. Looking forward to seeing you during the conference and for our Q&A.